Many thanks for staying with us. You're still watching Report Desk Africa. And now we go to Kenya, where fresh protests marred by violence and looting in the country have attracted a series of condemnations and calls for calm by high dignitaries, which include the African Union. Now, the protest began on March 20th after a call by opposition leader Raila Odinga for bi-weekly protests blamed President William Ruto for being unable to control the soaring cost of living and therefore called for his resignation. And please note that this protest is also to fight the incumbent government, because if you remember, Raila Odinga was never going to agree to the result of the elections that held last year. Now, sending a note of warning, President Ruto has threatened to deal with all those involved in criminal activities during Monday's protest. So far, at least 2 people have been confirmed dead, sadly. The protest has now entered its second week despite a ban imposed by the Inspector General of Police, Japhet Kume, when protests degenerated into riots. Do take a look at this clip and we'll be right back to discuss it.
Policemen are trained on how to handle protests. I'm very sure it is a unit that they take when they are training on how to handle groups and protests. We were doing rallies across this country. Business was going on as usual. We went to over 20 counties. Business was going on. We were campaigning in 2022. Business was going on. We are now demonstrating. Business should just go on because the work of the police is to control these crowds. And these crowds, they are very peaceful. We are waiting for instructions from our party leader.
It's hurting the economy. Once it hurts the economy, that very cost of living that we are talking about, actually it exacerbates the situation. So absolutely, there is need for restructuring this particular engagement. Demonstrations in and of themselves are not bad, but they are supposed to pass a message. If then we are going to push on at this rate, we might not even have a country.
As things are happening in Kenya, we keep our eyes on the situation. Now, joining us to discuss the Kenyan unrest is Raquel Muigai. She's a multimedia journalist from Nairobi. Thank you for joining us, Raquel. First of all, I must ask, I hope you are staying safe and everything is okay with you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Yes, I am doing good. My team members are also good, but it's not a very easy time, especially for journalists, because we do have high number of journalists getting attacked as the protests continue. Even last week when the protests began, we did have a number of journalists who were attacked and robbed. This day, today as well, as we speak, we have a journalist in hospital after police officers are alleged to have lobbed tear gas canisters directly at the vehicle that they were in. So it's definitely not an easy time for the journalists who are covering this particular protest, and hoping that as the weeks go by, something will give. But definitely, it's becoming worse every week as we speak.
Yes, it is, and it's really, it's giving us over here, and I believe across the continent, a lot of concern. Now, protests in Kenya have now entered the second week, but has it's been characterized by looting, property destruction. How exactly did all of this degenerate? We do know that when President Ruto came into power, there were speculations that things may get bad before becoming very good. Is this a case of things getting worse before eventually getting good, or things just getting worse?
To be honest, Bernard, from where I sit, things seem to be getting worse as the days go by. This is not the first time Kenya is having protests, really. These are things that have been happening in every democratic country, and Kenya being one of them. Therefore, protests happening was not anything that was supposed to create the kind of havoc that we have. However, every time the opposition has led protests in the country, we do experience this kind of pictures that we are getting at this point. When the protests began on 20th last week, it was businesses were shut down, and it's because of the previous scenarios of how things have been happening. You do find that the youths will take advantage of this situation and therefore rob bystanders, those who are not part of the protests, and even just loot and break into businesses. And therefore, that happened on Monday. Again on Thursday, when it began again on Monday, that is the same thing that happened. And now today on Thursday, we're still seeing a number of businessmen and business people complaining about the youth and some of these people who are said to be taking part in the protests, breaking into businesses, robbing a lot of people. And therefore, there's that one part of the divide that says the ones who are attending these protests diligently are not the ones doing this. And we also have the arguments of the claims that there are people who've been funded to actually create havoc and therefore create a situation whereby these demonstrations are going to be seen as illegal, they're going to be seen as something that is going to be detrimental to the country. But these are claims that have not yet been substantiated. But from what we are seeing as journalists on the ground is that there are youths who are taking advantage of the situation. And given the fact that there are a lot of unemployed people in the country, given the kind of situation that there is in the country, the high cost of living, I mean, it's inevitable that we're going to see a number of people taking advantage of this particular protest, but it still does not describe why it is getting worse every day. And we do hope that it's going to get better, but honestly, it doesn't look like it. Police officers are also not relenting as well. It's as if the kind of, they came out forcefully, because as per the law is that this particular protest is supposed to be peaceful. And therefore, if there are no riots, if these people are singing and going around the streets demanding what it is that they're demanding for, then I think as per the law is that they're supposed to be provided with security by the police officers. Unfortunately, that has not been the case, and we see police officers lobbing tear gas canisters, even on those people who have not rioted or even thrown stones. But it's becoming worse, especially in the areas where they're a bit highly populated, especially within the slum areas of Mathare, of Kibra being a stronghold of the opposition leader Raila Odinga. And just today, we did see that standoff between police officers and the locals, to the point where police officers had to retreat. And therefore, that creates a scenario where even journalists cannot be in that kind of space, and allows for the protesters to do as they please, even hurting those who are really not part of the protests. So to be honest, it doesn't look like it's going to get worse and then get better. It's honestly escalating to another side that none of us ever expected in the country, really.
All right, Raquel. Now, in a bid to crack down on these protests, the police chief announced a ban on the opposition demonstrations. And so far, we've seen how the police has handled the protests. What is your opinion on, the police involvement on the protest?
The thing is, as per the law, blessings, is that police officers are meant to provide security to protesters. Protesting is not the first time these things are happening. And once force is used by police officers, it therefore has to be called for. In the situation where we saw earlier today in Mathare, where protesters were pelting stones to police officers, then there is some sort of action that we do definitely expect from police officers. And therefore, that is to protect not only themselves, but also bystanders who are there continuing with their daily lives. But unfortunately, it has now turned to be more like a vengeful kind of situation where everyone seems to be bringing out their vengeance on each other. And that kind of situation has really not gone well. Earlier today, when some of the journalists were attacked, they were actually attacked by police officers. And you can see police officers lobbing tear gas canisters directly to vehicles that are occupied by journalists. And therefore, this is not something that should be happening. Police officers are meant to be providing security and protecting those who are protesting, because it's their right to do that. But also at the same time, it's also the duty of protesters to ensure that they do not wreak havoc on anyone else who's not part of the protest. These protests are meant to be peaceful. They're meant to drive their agenda without hurting or infuriating anyone. But unfortunately, that is not happening. And therefore, even with the government coming out and stating that they're not going to relent and stating that they're not going to agree to any handshake whatsoever, as was seen earlier between the former president Uhuru Kenyatta and opposition leader Raila Odinga, the government maintains that they did win the election fair and square. The court, they went to the court and nothing, the election results was sustained as it were. And therefore, whatever it is that they're demanding for is as per the government, does not make any sense. It cannot be substantiated. And therefore, there should be a balance. I think the government should come out, and definitely the first point of action should be investigating some of these cases involving the police officers, because we already have at least 2 people dead within this in this particular protest. Others are nursing injuries even in hospitals, and it's definitely a very bad situation as we speak. And the pictures that we've seen today, if this continues on Monday, then we'll definitely.
We seem to be losing communication with you. Can you still hear us? Raquel, can you hear us? Are you there?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. We kind of lost our communication towards the end as you were wrapping up that question, but I'll just move on from there. Now, you were also talking about how things, if this lingers on into next week, how bad it may get for Kenyans. Speaking about that, now the deputy president said that the demonstrations have cost the country about $15 million US, with Nairobi losing more than half of its daily revenue. Now, and I want to ask, we know how bad it has been for journalists, that we cannot, take our minds away from. But how about the ordinary Kenyans now? How have these, or how has this protest affected the daily livelihood of ordinary Kenyans? Can Kenya continue to afford, or even Nairobi continue to afford, to lose money and to lose investments daily? How are Kenyans being affected by this protest?
To be honest, blessing, Bernard, Kenyans cannot afford to continue in this kind of route. I mean, let's take, for example, and let me paint a scenario for you. We do have someone who sells boiled eggs in town, in the central business district in Nairobi, and therefore probably gets to earn at least between 6,000 shillings, Kenyan shillings, to 8,000 Kenyan shillings a day. Therefore, remove Monday and Thursday as days that he cannot continue that business. Therefore, where does that put him as the ordinary Kenyan, given the kind of situation that we have? Remember, there are businesses that their employers who've had to tell their employees not to attend work on Monday and Thursday. What does that mean for them as a company? And especially if this particular company is dependent on projects and deadlines. And therefore, it's really not a good time for any Kenyan, to be honest. Even for those who are not doing the daily jobs, like selling stuff along the streets, even those who do have businesses, you do find that protesters have broken into some of these businesses. We've had that scenario recorded today in Kisumu, that is the western side of Kenya. We've also had this particular case is reported again today within the central business district. And you find that a businessman complains of almost 1 million worth of goods 1 million Kenyan shillings worth of goods have been destroyed by protesters. They just get in and destroy every product that you have. If it was a supermarket, therefore you wake up the following morning and you don't have any of this goods. This is a lot of investment that has been done by these business people. And therefore, if this continues, then to be honest, there are a number of Kenyans who are already angered at this point because they cannot continue with their jobs. And Kenyans might make fun of it by the fact that you do have a long holiday, but for those who have businesses, especially within these areas that are considered high risk, it's really a sad situation for them, and especially for those who eke a living from their daily jobs. Those who do not have salaries at the end of the month, it's definitely a tough time for them as well.
Well, I think the only, or I would say most effective way out of this would be a dialogue. And regards to that, the AAU chairperson, Musa Muhammad, has called for calm and asked the stakeholders to engage in a dialogue to address the differences. Do you see this happening?
To be honest, it doesn't appear that kind of dialogue is going to happen. The president has come out and stated that if at all opposition leader Raila Odinga was really true and honest about what he really wanted, he would have called for a sit down and had that kind of conversation. The deputy president Rigathi Gachagua has also come out to state that it is very unfair for Raila Odinga to create the kind of scenario where business is not going on as usual. Definitely, we do have the African Union. We do also have the religious leaders in the country and other Kenyans calling for dialogue. But one thing is certain is that the deputy president has come out and he represents the government. He's come out to clearly state that that kind of dialogue is not happening. From his point of view, he states that this appears to be the opposition leader Raila Odinga demanding to have a place in government through the back door. Remember, the country passed through a certain period around 2019 when the demonstrations began, and it ended to the point where Raila Odinga and the former president Uhuru Kenyatta had that particular handshake that at least brought some kind of normalcy, and there was some semblance of peace in the country. But unfortunately, with the leaders, the current leaders that we have now, and especially with Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua coming out to clearly state that that is not going to happen, this conversation, this dialogue that everyone is calling for, doesn't seem to be happening. Earlier today, immediately after Raila Odinga and his team left the protests from the streets, he addressed the media and stated that there was an assassination attempt on his life, and it was evident that he did have a bullet vest, that he had adorned a bullet vest even during this particular protest. These are claims that have not yet been substantiated, but it clearly shows you. And
Raquel, I'm sorry, but we may have to suspend the conversation here. We hope that we can get you back so that we can continue this. But ultimately, we hope that these protests will come to an end. But unfortunately, because of time, we have to end it here. Thank you so much for joining us, Raquel Muigai, and we certainly hope that things get better in Kenya.